Hi there, my name is Sam Weaver. I'm on the Boulder City Council, and I want to talk to you today about why Boulder is continuing to try and create an electric utility that's owned by the city. We're currently served by Xcel Energy, which is an investor-owned monopoly utility, and the city thinks that we should join 29 other public electric utilities in the state of Colorado. We have a bunch of reasons that we want to do this, but we'll start with democratize, decarbonize, and decentralize our electricity system. So we live in an era where climate change is becoming more and more prominent of an issue, and it's an existential threat to both the continued prosperity of humanity as well as to our city's ability to avoid natural disasters like floods and fires. As we've seen with the hurricanes that have hit in the Caribbean, as well as the huge fires that are going on right now in California, we need, as a city, to prepare ourselves for a future in which weather and climate disasters are in front of us. And we have two ways in which we need to address this. We need to prepare for the disasters, and we also need to rapidly decarbonize our electricity supply. This is a huge moral issue for our city and our community to deal with, and I want to talk about why having a Boulder-owned electric utility would get us to where we need to be. I want to start with saying that this is a generational decision. This is not a decision where the costs and benefits need to be thought of for the next 3 or 5 or 7 years. It's something we need to think about how our children and future generations will relate to their energy supply and their ability to respond to natural disasters. So we recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of our open space system in Boulder. And one of the stories I heard at the celebration, the 50th anniversary celebration, I want to share with you. In 1962, a large developer had bought Enchanted Mesa, which is the prominent mesa that sits in front of the Flatirons where In-Car is now. And that developer had planned a very large hotel and a subdivision to go in there. And Boulder had recently passed the Blue Line Law, which was an attempt to preserve the mountain backdrop for the enjoyment of all citizens of Boulder. And so this developer was proceeding with his plans, and a group of local activists in Boulder organized and decided that the public should have access to Enchanted Mesa for future generations. And in order to do that, they petitioned the city and asked the city council to look at how much it would cost to purchase Enchanted Mesa in a condemnation. And so the city council and staff worked through the estimate process, and they said it'll be $105,000. And so the citizens said, that's good, we should bond for that, and we should pay that money and condemn the land. And so the activists went out into neighborhoods and knocked on doors, gathered a petition, and caused an election to be held, which passed. And that election said the city of Boulder could bond $105,000 in order to buy Enchanted Mesa and keep it from being developed. And so they went to condemnation court, and the developer said the land was worth $1.2 million. And the city said, well, we have $105,000 and we think that's what it's worth. And the judge in condemnation court said it's not worth $1.2 million and it's not worth $105,000, it's worth $115,000. And the city said, wow, that's great, but we only have $105,000. So the citizens of Boulder gathered their energy and went out and knocked on doors and held bake sales and gathered the extra $10,000 and preserved Enchanted Mesa. And that was the start of the open space system and the open space movement in Boulder. That led to the open space tax being passed, and then today, 50 years later, we have 45,000 acres of open space and 150 miles of trails that are enjoyed by over 1 million visitors a year. This is a visionary thing that the citizens of Boulder did. It set the tone for the way Boulder would grow and evolve for the next 50 years. Environmentalism at the center, constrained growth boundaries, the interaction between the university and the national labs, and the ability to bring In-Car here. All of these things came from that kernel of inspiration that led to the next 50 years of evolution of open space. And here we are this year in 2017 looking at measures 2L, 2O, and 2P, which will continue our efforts to municipalize and take control of our energy future. So there's a bunch of reasons that we should do this, and I want to share them with you. So if we look at the other 29 utilities in Colorado that are owned by cities and operated by cities, what we find is they're much more reliable than the utility that we have in Boulder today. So if we look at Fort Collins, which owns its own electric utility, they're 5 times more reliable than the service that we have in Boulder right now. If we look at Longmont, another city in Colorado that operates its own electric utility, they're twice as reliable as Boulder is. Generally, if you look across the country, municipal utilities tend to be much more reliable than investor-owned utilities because they answer to their constituents who vote on the people that regulate the utility, as opposed to the way it is in Colorado today, where the utility is regulated from Denver by the Public Utilities Commission, an unelected body appointed by the governor, and the utility operations report to their shareholders who are in all over the world, but their headquarters is in Minneapolis. So we have very little way right now of addressing our energy future. And the reliability piece is one very important issue. But if you look at Longmont, we see another really interesting way that electric utilities benefit their customers. Because in Longmont, they were able to leverage the cash flow and the infrastructure of their electric utility to create a municipal broadband utility. So in Longmont today, because of the foresight of the folks who formed their electric utility and then their municipal broadband, for $50 a month, you can get gigabit Ethernet to the home. And that's going to create jobs, that's going to create access for people who can have educational opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. So the benefits to the community of having an electric utility are many. Another benefit is that typically rates in municipal electric utilities are 15% lower than in investor-owned utilities. So today, the cash flow, the revenues to Xcel Energy from Boulder are about $150 million a year. And of that $150 million a year, about $30 million plus goes in profits to Minneapolis, which is where their headquarters are. That $30 million a year could stay in the Boulder economy and circulate locally. A lot of people have questions about whether Boulder could actually do a good job at operating its utility if we form it. And I would say absolutely. We currently operate a wonderful water utility, a sewer utility, a floodwater utility, and have for many, many years. Adding an electric utility would look like this going forward. We would separate from Xcel under the directions that we've got from the PUC. Once the systems were separated, we would probably bring in a professional third-party operator to begin to run the system. There are many private companies that contract with cities to operate their electric utilities, and we would start there. Moving forward, should we choose to, we could train up and staff up our own utility operators, or distribution system operators, or we could stick with the contractors. That would be a decision that we could make as we move forward. But once we have a municipal utility, the options available to Boulder are many. We can choose our own generation source, so we can contract with outside wind operators to be able to add new wind to the system and supply Boulder with wind energy. We'd be able to have as much solar as we want. One of the limits that people don't necessarily understand right now is that Xcel limits both the amount of solar you can put on a single facility and the overall amount of solar that can be installed over time. Instead of having that limit imposed on us by an outside operation, we would be able to decide for ourselves how we configure our circuits, how much storage we have. Right now, storage deployment is limited and controlled by Xcel Energy, a vertically integrated monopoly utility who doesn't like penetration of distributed generation and storage systems. But we could take those decisions into our own hands. Another thing that we would be able to do is allow transactional energy. In other words, if CU wanted to buy more solar and somebody else in Boulder wanted to put up a solar farm to supply CU with that energy, they could run that across our grid. We wouldn't have any reason that we wouldn't want that transaction, that arrangement to happen, whereas right now Xcel doesn't allow that kind of thing. So another issue that I wanted to address today is the issue of the future of Xcel Energy. So Xcel Energy has brought forward a plan to get to 55% renewable electricity by 2026. And that plan is great, and I want to give kudos to Xcel for being willing to advance such a plan. But right now that's all it is a proposal to the Public Utilities Commission. We don't know how they'll react. We don't know if Xcel will be able to finance this. Xcel has stipulated that they will own half of all of the renewables and 80% of all the new natural gas that will come forward, which is also something that we need to think about carefully. But even if Xcel brings forward 55% renewable electricity, that does not get Boulder to its climate goals. Our climate goals are 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and 80% carbon emissions reductions by 2050. These are critical goals. Every community in the world is going to have to attain goals of that size in order for us to address this existential threat of climate change. So for the past 18 months, I have been part of a team that was negotiating with Xcel about what could we possibly do in partnership with each other. And the key question came down to, they might be able to get to 55% renewables, which would be great, but how could Boulder get to its climate goals of 100% renewable electricity? And we explored options. We explored community choice aggregation. We explored Boulder owning its own sustainability utility and generating power and selling it back to Xcel. But at the end of the day, we were not able to come to any kind of firm arrangement for how Boulder could meet its climate goals while we stay with Xcel. So that is one of the main reasons why I advocate continuing forward with our utility exploration, because the Public Utilities Commission has given us a clear path towards being able to separate from the Xcel system. They have told us, here is how you will hook your distribution system up to the transmission system. They have said, you are free to go forward into condemnation court to find out how much the poles and wires will cost you to acquire. And you are free to go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to find out what stranded assets are. So when we look at the possibility of separating from Xcel, we have to consider what the impact on rates would be, and that means that we have to know how much the assets will cost to go forward. We are at a time, because the Public Utilities Commission has handed this victory which you will not have heard about in the newspaper, because the newspaper doesn't see anything as a victory for Boulder. I won't go on about the daily camera and its relation to the MUNI, but at the end of the day, you need to understand the facts, and the facts are that we've been handed a path forward by the Public Utilities Commission. And in this process, we have moved Xcel's thinking. Part of the reason that they're proposing this plan is in response to what the City of Boulder has done. And there's no reason to give up our seat at the table and our leverage going forward. So you'll hear people talking about the high cost of this municipal exploration that we're doing. I'm here to tell you it's not a very high cost at all. So the amount that we've spent so far is about $14 million. The amount that we would spend for the next steps doing the engineering and the separation work would be $16 million. That totals up to about $30 million, which is less than 1 year's profits that are taken out of our community every year. The scale to understand here is that the revenues generated on the electrical system are about $150 million a year. That's what would now be the cash flow that we would use to fund the startup and the ongoing operations. And all the math the city has done with expected startup costs are that our rates would be at parity or lower than Xcel's going forward, even with the changes in costs that we've been told by the Public Utilities Commission. So this stands to be good for rates now, but great for rates once the startup costs are paid off. A typical municipal electric utility has rates that are 15% below investor-owned electric utilities. Winter Park, Florida, municipalized 10 years ago. Their reliability is already much higher and their rates are lower than the investor-owned utility that they separated from. This is the kind of model that we want going forward. so that we can emulate Longmont and use our electric utility to bring us broadband, and we can emulate Fort Collins to have reliability that's 5 times better than what we have today. We want to have new business models available on our grid, which do the transactive energy, but they also allow new technologies to couple to the grid and see if they will work with the grid going forward, and to qualify them to be part of our grid. So it will stimulate the economy in the clean energy sector. It will improve reliability. It will reduce rates. What's not to like about this? Further and foremost, it will allow us to choose how to decarbonize our electricity system. We have to respond to global warming, and we have to respond by decarbonizing and by becoming more resilient. Another thing that control of our grid will enable for us is the ability to be more resilient in times of flood and fire. So for example, when Hurricane Sandy blew through New York City, a few of the co-ops that exist within New York City were able to island themselves from the grid. They were able to separate and generate their own electricity. And so these few buildings in New York City had electricity throughout the hurricane, while all of their neighbors were without power. We have a Department of Energy grant right now in the city of Boulder that is studying islanding a neighborhood in Martin Acres, so that if there were a flood, this neighborhood in Martin Acres would be able to separate from the grid and generate its own power. All of those good ideas are things that right now we can't do with the Excel system. And those are things that we need to do to prepare our community for the impacts of climate change and to be able to stop contributing to climate change. So at the end of the day, we need to think about the decision on 2L and 2O and 2P as generational opportunities for us in Boulder. Opportunities for us to set things in motion like was done 50 years ago with the open space system. Opportunities to create a new future, a better future for the children and our children's children who will be in Boulder. Visions like the blue line, which stopped development into the mountain backdrop. Vision like no auto traffic on Pearl Street to create a vibrant heart for our downtown. And visions again like the open space system. That's what we can have with the municipal electric utility going forward. So please vote yes on 2L, 2O, and 2P.